welcome everybody. I'm Giuliano Denico from UCL and IPMA, and today it's my pleasure to announce and to launch really our global keynote of Megaproject CEOs. And I'm delighted to welcome Mike Thurston as our inaugural CEO with his insights on HS2 and leadership and management. Mark has a fantastic track record, different levels, the project program, corporate levels, as well, both in the UK and internationally with some fantastic projects before joining HS2. Mark, we are very much looking forward to your keynote today. So without any further ado, over to you, a warm welcome, and the show is yours.
Thanks, Giuliano, and thanks to you and the team at UCL and IPME for putting this series on. I'm honoured to kick off this CEO series on Megaproject. So my intent, folks, thank you for dialing in and listening to us. I understand we've picked this time of day so it works for different time zones. So I understand this is a pretty diverse audience. So hopefully I'll try to make this as relevant. I want to bring HS2 to life, talk a little bit about my sort of personal leadership challenges in this role, bring into play some of the thinking I did with UCL. For those who don't know, I'm a visiting professor on the advisory board at the Bartlett School of Sustainable Construction at UCL. So I've worked with Giuliano and some of the team there now for some time. And I want to try and bring some of the thinking I've done with the team there to this sort of just phenomenon that is mega projects, and HS2 is very much that. So to give us the presentation a bit of structure, I hope we can get through this in sort of 30 minutes or so, and hopefully Giuliano will sort of take questions via the chat function, and we'll leave us a bit of time for any sort of a few questions at the end. So I'm going to talk a little bit, items 1 and 2 on here are really sort of what we're doing, so try and bring the scale of HS2 to life. Sections 3 through 6 and 7, 3, 4, 5, 6, and 7 is really sort of how we're going about it, and that sort of really bringing to life the leadership challenge, not just for me, but the organisation as a whole. And then sort of really finish number 8, slightly counterintuitively back to front, why is HS2 important? But we'll sort of finish there as we perhaps then take some time for Q&A. So let's introduce Britain's mega project. So HS2 is, I've been lucky enough, as Giuliano said in his introduction, to work on Crossrail, worked on the London Olympics, and when I ran the European business at CH2M, we were involved in some sort of fantastic big projects around the continent. But HS2, frankly, is on another whole scale. I think the sort of Oxford and McKinsey definition of a mega project is anything over $1 billion. Well, phase 1 alone is £44.6 billion. So we've got further phases, a multi-phase project, building a railway south from Birmingham to London in the first phase, north to Crewe from Birmingham, what we call phase 2A, and then ultimately the intent is to go into Manchester and potentially an eastern leg as well. So, this is a significant undertaking on behalf of the British government. We've already spent and sunk £11 billion into this programme to date. And as the slide shows there, our civils contracts alone are mega projects in their own right. So Balfour Beatty Vancey, Align, EKFB, the two contractors in the central section, and then our friends at Skanska, Costain, Strabag in the south. And again, I just brought those contracts to life because that just again gives a sense of the scale of what we intend to do. The other important point about HS2, of course, is it becomes the sort of spine and the backbone of the UK rail network. So it's very important for us, as the picture shows, you've got the existing network sort of travelling north, and the intent is to integrate the high-speed system into the conventional system, and this is about putting much needed capacity into our rail system. So that's a bit of sense of the scale. I just want to talk a little bit about, and I'll come back to some detail on that. I just want to talk a little bit about my time in this role. It's a job now I've had for over 4 years, and frankly, having been lucky enough to work around some big projects, my remit here when I first arrived from the chair was to get HS2 to move really from what would have been a development project, a development company, and as you can see on the left hand of this slide, phase 1 Royal Ascent just in the February of 17. I arrived shortly after that, and as you can see from the sort of milestones that have flowed in my 4 years, it's been very much about making HS2 a delivery organisation. But that in itself it sort of oversimplifies the reality. By about 2018, the end of my first year, we had some 4,500 people working right across HS2. At the time, that was probably around 1,200 in the company that I run. HS2 Limited is a government company. I'll come back to the governance in a little bit later. And about 3,000 plus people in the supply chain. That number is now 16,000. You know, this is a national endeavour. This is a project on a whole different scale. And frankly, through those 4 years, my job has been to sort of navigate the organisation through, you know, some pretty choppy water. If you go through the middle there, where the chairman's stock take the Oakley review, that's when we had a change of political leadership in the UK, and there was a sort of big review of the programme. Frankly, was it the right thing to continue to invest in this project? Was the right project for the UK? And of course, more recently, in the last 15 months, we've all had to have this sort of common shared experience of dealing with the impact of a pandemic, and that's been, as you can imagine, a challenge for something on the scale of what we have at HS2. But nevertheless, you know, it's a huge privilege to lead this organisation, and as the organisation has grown and matured, again, a theme I'll come back to, we've all actually achieved a hell of a lot. And again, you can see from the milestones, you know, we've awarded contracts for stations, we've started to install permanent assets, and we very much have sort of momentum across all of the sort of 3 commission phases. So that's London to Birmingham, Birmingham to Crewe, and Crewe to Manchester, which we call phase 2B, western leg there. So, you know, we very much had a pretty intense 4 years. You sort of imagine that a project of this scale would have a sort of quite a sort of maybe a more measured pace to it. It's relentless, and I think that sort of personal challenge around how you maintain sort of pace and balance, I'll come back to again in the presentation. So I just want to sort of unpick that scale a little bit more to put some sense of dimensions onto this. So 344 miles, about 550 kilometres all up, all the way if you were to go all the way into Leeds and Manchester from London. So again, we've not built a railway north of London in the UK since the Victorian times, and that railway served us very well. But as you can see, this railway will traverse, you know, assets, natural and man-made, right across really what is almost a third of the length of the country. Massive amount of tunnelling to be done. Of course, the legislation requires us to minimise the impact on the environment in the construction of the railway. So just an acronym on the left-hand side there, an area of natural beauty. So those are protect areas. So we're tunnelling under and looking after, making sure we protect the ecology and the environment in certain parts of the route. The Colne Valley Viaduct on the right-hand side there, as it says, will be the longest rail bridge ever constructed, some 3.5 kilometres long. So the sort of the engineering challenge in itself is vast, and you know, I'm really pleased to say that our first 2 tunneling machines are in the ground. The first one only a few weeks ago, so now I think it's delivered 15, 16 rings going north from what we call the South Portal, and its sister machine, that was Florence, and her sister machine, Cecilia, literally is going in the ground as we speak this week and next, and is really just starting to get the first rings laid. So you know, we're very much now moving out of a phase where we've been doing all the procurement and design, and we're getting into construction. And again, you'll get a sense, this audience, the scale of what we're building. And I tended there to refer to a lot of the civil engineering. Of course, a railway wouldn't really be a railway unless you could get passengers off and on it. So 4 new stations, terminus at London at one end, Curzon Street in Birmingham at the other for the first phase. And then we've got Old Oak Common, which is going to be a super crucial hub, probably the biggest railway hub in the country when it's complete. Over 250,000 passengers a day will be able to use Old Oak Common. It's going to connect to the existing new Crossrail system that opens next year, connect you to the existing Western Railway on our network here in the UK, as well as be able to get to Heathrow Airport. Interchange will be a similar sort of model station, but just south of Birmingham, connect to the airport. So, you know, these stations themselves are massive undertakings, hundreds of millions of pounds of investment in certainly the 2 Birmingham stations, and you're into billions of pounds for Old Oak and Euston. And of course, there's a sort of nice symmetry around the London to Birmingham Curzon Street, because that actually was the very first intercity, as it was called then, journey on our railways in the UK between London and Birmingham Curzon Street in 1838. So here we are, sort of symmetrically, several years later, rebuilding that piece of railway to connect the 2 major cities of the UK. And again, just to sort of unpick phase one a bit more in terms of its scale, you can read the statistics yourself on the left-hand side. The physical construction in itself is significant. We've got the biggest land acquisition program we've seen in the UK since the Second World War, over £3 billion worth of investment in property. We now own at HS2, on behalf of the Secretary of State, some 1,600 properties along the phase one route alone. So we're a major landowner now in where we've purchased the land to allow us to build the railway. HS2 will be the biggest environmental project we've ever taken on in the UK. Huge amount of work around creating a green corridor and planting some 7 million trees and shrubs along the phase one route so that the finished railway sort of very much blends into the natural environment. And to the picture bottom right, HS2 has also been and continues to be the biggest archaeology project we've ever seen here in the UK. The picture in question is the roundhouse that we discovered at Burren Curzon Street. We had somewhere in excess of 1,000 archaeologists working on the project at one point. And if there are any Australians on the call today, you may well have picked up the fact that we found the grave of Matthew Flinders, who was very much the discoverer, the sailor who discovered Australia. So, and we had a lot of fun, working with his family and sort of, exhuming his remains and sort of reinstating those. So, a real sort of unleashing a history of parts of the UK in creating the space to build this railway. And I just wanted to put the sort of a bit of data, I guess, into the system in terms of the time, money, access. So you can see here we are today, July 2021, about £11 billion spent. Of course, the interesting thing is this is a multi-phase project. So having got notice to proceed, which is a big decision to restart the civils phase on phase one, we got royal assent for phase, there's notice to proceed, it's actually royal assent for phase 2A earlier this year. In the meantime, we're carrying on with the bill and developing legislation for the second phase into Manchester. And as the graph shows, it takes us out really to the late 2030s, early 2040s, and some 60, 70 billion pounds worth of investment to get this railway all the way to Manchester. So one of the challenges, and the reason I wanted to share this slide, is the organisation has needed to set itself up to deal with this investment challenge and this organisation challenge over an enduring period of time. And that's where I want to introduce this sort of concept of homeostasis. So that's one definition at the bottom of the slide, the state of steady internal and physical conditions maintained by living systems. So it's really a biological term, but when I did some work with UCL on this previously, we were sort of stood back and sort of, really what are the, what's the sort of the source of and at the heart of sort of managing mega projects. And to be fair, the four quadrants that are on here, leadership and people, governance controls, what I call the outside world, and culture and organization, are by no means exhaustive. It's just a framework we developed to try and sort of articulate what are the various dimensions of mega projects. And the key, and something that I've become very aware of as the CEO in this job now for 4 years, is that I'm ultimately really judged on two things. One, are we delivering the program on time, on cost and safe and all the rest of it? And is the organization fit for purpose? There are lots of other things that get measured on, as does the organization, but at its heart, those two things are sort of primary. And I've spent a lot of my time focusing on those two areas. So when we look at this idea of homeostasis and keeping balance of all the various physical conditions, that's going to be something I want to talk about, and I've learned a huge amount about myself, but also the organization. How do we keep all these things in balance on any given day? Because the reality is they are all live and in play on every single day of this project. So I'm just going to take each one of those quickly in turn. So leadership and people. So the picture across the top is really just a very simplified view of the life cycle. It's not particularly revolutionary. That we've got this hybrid build stage for us, which is about the legislation. Once we get consent through and we've got an act of law, which we have now for the first two phases, we move through these phases of all the enabling work. So that's the ecology, the archaeology, the utilities, demolitions, preparing the ground, effectively acquiring the land, civil systems, testing, and opening the railway. The reality is today, we've got all of those things at the bottom in place. So as I've already said, we're delivering construction for phase one, which is the most further advanced. Having just got royal assent, we're now setting ourselves to transition into delivery for phase 2A. So enabling works, land acquisition, thinking about ecology. A lot of that was very seasonally dependent. So we're sort of thinking there. And then, of course, phase 2B, we don't have the power. So we're developing legislation, consulting with people on the route. There are sort of millions of postcodes, millions of people and thousands of postcodes that are affected by the route of this railway. And our job is to always be sensitive to the impact that our work is going to have on those folks. So this creates a real sort of challenge for the organisation. So as the organisation has evolved over my time, and as I come back to sort of my sort of primary brief when I arrived, it was about getting the organisation match fit. You have to deal with this dimension. It's not just a delivery organisation, but actually it's working at multiple phases. Leadership, we've done a huge amount of work around capability. We used a slightly bespoke version of the CMMI maturity model, which some of you might be aware of. We had to actually evidence to government that the organisation met a certain test for capability. And that was a 2-year program to get us to sort of almost a base level. And we've actually moved that on in some areas of capability in the last 12 months. Done a huge amount of work around succession planning, mentoring, coaching, leadership development, because inevitably, we're all in with the world of mega projects, a sort of race for talent, and a project of the sort of duration and the scale of HS2. It's incumbent on us to make sure we invest in the people in our organisation, and we create organic growth as well as supplement that with clearly partners from our supply chain. We've done a lot of work around role modelling. I'm going to talk a little bit about culture in a minute. So the picture bottom left is me with one of our former graduates and an apprentice who works with Kate. And then, that's on the right-hand side at the bottom there, that's a set of apprentices. Most of us, I think, have now completed their apprenticeship. They did 2 years. But there's this legacy around skills. How are we, as leaders, creating an organisation that's diverse? We're creating opportunities for young people to join the sector, and actually they can spend what could be a good chunk of the early part of their career working on HS2. So let's talk about governance and controls. This, as you can imagine, is a very simplified picture of the arrangements for HS2, but we sit very much sort of in the middle of this diagram. We're accountable to the Department for Transport as the sponsoring department, and the HS2 Act is effectively enshrined in the name of the Secretary of State. And what we've done is standing up a supply chain is very much try to create what I call the HS2 family. So how do we bring other organisations into HS2 to help us deliver the works? And we're generally going to much more sort of collaborative, integrated teams. Why is that? Well, because the scale of what we're doing means that decision-making, sort of the agility of the organisation, the interaction between the sort of client as us and the contractors and designers needs to be such that time is so precious. The more integrated we are, the more collaborative we are, the sort of more agile and arguably the more efficient we'll be. So we're very much at the beginning of that journey of building an integrated supply chain. But of course, on the right-hand side of this picture, I'm accountable to, and there's all sorts of, as you can imagine, government and other parliamentary scrutiny of HS2, recognising the scale of public investment. HS2 is all publicly funded. So our National Audit Office audits our accounts. I have to go to parliamentary committees. We have a dedicated task force that I was actually this morning with ministers. So we're in an environment where the governance in itself warrants a significant amount of leadership effort just to make sure you navigate your way around this complex landscape. And of course, in doing that, as the leader of the organisation, I have to set priorities for the organisation. So come back to the sort of concept of homeostasis and maintaining balance. How do you juggle on any given day all the demands on the organisation? So again, using this slide to sort of prompt sort of our thinking, how do we make sure with so many people working that we maintain a level of health and safety, not just in the field, but the well-being of our staff? And that's been really important over the last 15 months with COVID. Clearly, our focus is on program delivery. That's why we exist, albeit across multiple phases. But we have to do that in a way that is respectful of the people that are impacted by our work. People did not choose to live or work or go to school or wherever, live their lives adjacent to the route of this railway. So we need to maintain our license to operate by being very respectful about the way we deliver the work. And that's going to be crucial for political support, because clearly where we don't meet our expectations and we don't meet those standards, the local parliamentarians will be the first to make the ministers I report to aware of the challenges. And we need political support on a project like this. We've had at HS2 now sort of cross-party support, both sides the political house in Parliament are supportive of the scheme, and you need that because a project of this gestation, it inevitably transcends parliamentary periods. And then more recently, over the last year, I think as we've all become much more aware of the impact we're having on our planet, how we take carbon out of our economies, transport is now the biggest generator of carbon in the UK. So how do we create a sustainable system, and how does the high-speed rail system make a contribution to net zero 2050, and how do we sort of make sure that the railway has got its place in just protecting the natural environment, but also giving something back to the natural environment through the life of the project. And again, all these things are in play every day to varying degrees, and the job of the organisation is to keep all these things in balance. And of course, I've touched on mobilising the supply chain. These integrated teams are really starting to bear fruit. The scale of what we're doing, where we've now got thousands of people mobilised in the field, means it's going to be crucial. And this is very much now sort of what I call a national endeavour. There are some 2,000 organisations around the UK working on HS2. And HS2 is really what we call two sort of fundamental roles here. We're the program integrator, so you have to bring the whole program together. So that, the work we let to the supply chain, how we join all the interfaces up, and make sure that the whole program delivers the outcomes that government has specified. But also we're the system integrator. So the railway is very much a system. We've got to bring trains and track and the infrastructure together, as well as the operators. And we increasingly spend time at HS2 now is very much in delivery, talking about our role as the program and the system integrator, with clearly our supply chain working with our teams in integrated fashion, physically delivering the works. And of course, as you can imagine, I mentioned scrutiny earlier, whether it's from Parliament or the board or the department, but accountability and transparency of our management information is crucial. We generate nearly 7 million points of data every month, as the slide says. I'm just about to sign off my annual accounts. We issue a corporate plan to government every year. We do a 6-month, we support the minister giving a 6-month report to Parliament. So again, in this sort of space around governance and controls, we've had to establish an enterprise platform and ingestion system that can just deal with the sheer volume of management information that's coming from our contractors, so we can ultimately synthesize that down to, if need be, a handful of sheets of paper that's appropriate for a minister of government, and obviously, and any other users of that information in between. So sort of monitoring delivery is a huge undertaking on a project like this, as you can imagine. So just moving on to the sort of other dimension to this sort of balanced model of homeostasis and talking about culture and organisation. When I got to HS2, these were the 4 values, and the question was, well, how do you want to use the values, and what do we do to them today? And the answer was, we sort of probably don't do very much. So what we've done over the last few years is really brought our values to life. We talk about our values at the beginning of the meetings. We've nominated values champions. We have values awards where staff on a peer-to-peer basis can nominate colleagues for sort of exemplifying conduct and effort around one of our values. And what it's done is they've really, I think, become a number of things. They've created a language in the organisation everyone understands. It's got people talking about what the values mean to them in a very personal way. And that sort of vulnerability actually has created a culture of openness and honesty and inherently trust around that. Candidly, the values have been crucial for us in the last 15 months, where the majority of staff have been working remotely. We've not been connected in our offices. And again, I think the values have been the sort of glue that help keep the organisation together. And then increasingly, our supply chain is adopting the values. So much of our supply chain is in joint ventures. So what they would do is take our values and they would interpret them in a way that's relevant for them. And what that means is we're sort of extending the culture and the HS2 family into these thousands of people, these thousands of organisations, all bound together by sort of one set of core values that really drive the program. And we shouldn't underestimate the work we've done here. I know that's creating a sort of culture of sort of one enterprise with one aim in mind. And as I said earlier, we've done a huge amount of work on organisational capability. We've done a lot of development around team performance. I often refer to my management team about what we take HS2 is like a bit of an elite sport, and we need to condition ourselves and think about our application as project practitioners in the sort of, almost to draw a parallel with sort of elite athletes or elite sports people. So we've done a lot of work around team performance, program performance, and investing in our capability, because again, with a long-term program like this, there's an opportunity to really get a return on that investment with our staff, whether it's our apprentices at sort of one end of our organization or our senior leaders at the other end of the organization. And frankly, not only are we sort of building a sense of national pride around the project, but what we're doing is creating a capability for the UK that not only will then be available to deliver the pipeline of projects for this country, but arguably is exportable to a global market. And then I think the other area where we put increasingly amount, where we're putting increasing amount of effort is on innovation, and whether it's sort of wearable headgear, whether it's robots for dealing with sensitive bits of plant, whether we're using battery-powered plant rather than moving away from diesel. There's a whole array of activity where we're building on some really good work that was done on Crossrail, some work that's now sat in a forum called I3P, which is the Infrastructure Industry Innovation Platform here in the UK. And we're very much building on the back of that. And we're really seeing our supply chain come together with us to use innovation to drive sort of faster, cleaner, smarter ways of doing delivery. And again, I think the legacy there is profound because the scale of what we're doing on HS2 gives an opportunity to really change the way we do some things in our sector. And then sort of final dimension to my model is what I call the outside world. Whenever you work on these big projects, there's always an external dimension to them. Most of what I've talked about thus far is sort of very internal looking, and just sort of kicking this section off. There's me on site last September where we sort of notified the start of construction proper for phase 1. It's joined on site by the Prime Minister, who's a big supporter of big infrastructure projects. We know that from his time as mayor. He was instrumental in really giving HS2 the green light. And as he says, projects like this have got the opportunity to transform our economy, transform our transport system. And as I've already said, you sort of need the right level of political support and leadership for projects like this to be a success. But of course, that requires managing on my part and the part of the organization. So we exist in HS2 in a very complex stakeholder environment, whether it's dealing with Parliament itself and Westminster, whether it's the regional mayors and dealing with the politicians along the line of route. As I've already touched on, there are communities right along the route that we need to consult with. We'll naturally get a voice in the way we do our work and how we do our work. Clearly the unions have got a role to play, recognising the number of people that we employ. And of course, there are thousands of businesses that have and want to be part of HS2, and how we engage with the business community to make sure we create the opportunities. So as the investment in HS2 creates that multiplier effect into the economy, particularly to small and medium-sized businesses, so we really drive value into the UK. So this, again, is all part of managing the sort of external dimensions of HS2. And as you can imagine, I've sort of cantered through some facets to it there, but it's actually much more complex and demanding on the leadership team in real life. Inevitably, HS2 divides opinion. As big projects, all mega projects always, in my experience, divide opinion. They always draw comment, and we're no different at HS2. So the media are very quick, of course, to remind you what you've not done very well or you could be doing better. But actually, we've seen a shift there in the media in recent weeks, launching the tunneling machine. The work we're doing on skills now and bringing young people into the sector is starting to change the narrative around how we can really drive HS2 into a much positive light in the eyes of the media. And the fact that this is a project that's going to be we can and should be of huge pride to the country, and these things all hang together. So the political support, dealing with all those stakeholders, helps then drive, I think, a media sort of engagement, which again is something that we are constantly engaged with. And my job as CEO is to very much give voice to the thousands of people working on the project, because people clearly, in a social media environment, this stuff matters, and we need to be very sensitive to that. So just final couple of slides from me. So why do we need HS2? What makes it so important? So capacity, clearly the COVID has had an impact across the world on aviation and general travel more broadly. Certainly we're starting to see a pickup in train travel now in the UK, but in the long term, this is a project for 100, 150 years. We'd all hope to think that COVID will be something that's behind us within sort of 10 months, and it's going to take us 10 years to build the first phase of the railway. So we're really building capacity into our rail system for several generations to come. And that's not just about capacity on the system between the major cities, which is what the high-speed system does, but of course what that then does is sort of release massive capacity onto the existing network. So we can put better local services on, we can put more freight onto the off the roads and onto the railways. And arguably, to the point around cutting carbon, we can get people out of aeroplanes and out of domestic air and get them using high-speed train travel to get between the major cities. And as I said, transport is now the biggest generator of carbon in the UK. So we see HS2 as having a pivotal impact, not just in terms of what it gives back in legacy to the natural environment, but actually helping decarbonise our transport system and seeing train travel as an important point. And that seems to be a trend for what we see in other parts of the world, actually. And then finally, better connectivity. You often hear our government talk about levelling up. We have a slightly skewed economy in the UK, where London and the South East tends to dominate economically. And of course, what HS2 does, really connecting the Midlands to the North with much better connections, much better capacity, is drive investment in skills, drive investment in business. And that connectivity is crucial to having a much more balanced economy, a much more balanced country. So these are what we call the 3 C's: capacity, carbon, and connectivity are really the drivers for what we call the strategic case for HS2. And there's our strategic goals. They've been enshrined for many years now. They're pretty self-evident. I've touched on all of those to varying degrees, but we measure these. We're leading edge in UK government projects in that we're capturing our benefits now. So we know what we're doing around skills and employment. We know what we're doing today in terms of driving health and safety standards. We can see the value for money going into the link into catalysts for growth. So we can see the opportunities for businesses along the route, and clearly things like the customer experience and driving what will be a sort of 21st century world-class customer experience is an aspiration we're working towards when we finally open the railway. Throughout all that, we've got to be a good neighbour. We have to find a way of sustainably building this railway that takes respect of, as I've already said, those folks that live along the route. So I think just to sort of maybe conclude, this leadership challenge is keeping all these things in play. The framework I've used here hopefully just made some sense. We've sort of landed with our colleagues at UCL on this term Homeostasis as a way of sort of articulating the balance between the sort of just multiplicity of demands on my time and on the organisation's time. But nevertheless, 4 years in, we've got great momentum. We're delivering across all 3 phases. The work we've done in investing in the organisation, the capability and the culture of the organisation has been crucial in allowing us to sustain the momentum that we've built over the last few years. And actually what's become really obvious to me is in COVID, where we've had to sort of work remotely, it's almost become more important. So as we sort of come out the other side of the pandemic and we find a new way of working, I think this idea of keeping ourselves in balance, looking after ourselves, looking after the organisation, working with our supply chain to create one sort of homogenous culture for the whole HS2 family is going to be crucial for the success of this project. So Giuliano, I'm going to stop there, and perhaps I can stop sharing my screen and we can perhaps go to time for some questions.
Fantastic. That was a brilliant talk, Mark. Thanks very much for that. We have several questions here, and I have some points myself as well. If we could start with a very important point that you mentioned, is about changing the narrative of megaprojects and the legacy that you're building beyond the physical asset. So there is digital legacy, but much beyond that, there is a social element to that. And I guess building on your trajectory as starting your career as an apprentice, I wonder how you feel about those values and enacting them as the CEO of this project, and how future megaprojects perhaps can learn from that legacy beyond the narrative on cost.
Yeah, I think that's super important. It's certainly been part of my education in this job. And those of us that have grew up in engineering or construction or the project management environment, we sort of love practicing what we've learned through the life of our career. And sometimes it's quite easy to sort of get slightly obsessed with the sort of the purity of project delivery or project management or engineering or wherever it might be in whatever field that mega project exists. I think the trick for us increasingly, particularly where these projects draw a huge amount of public funding, and of course governments all over the world on the back of the pandemic more than ever are challenged to sort of prioritize where they invest public money, taxpayers' money into, and frankly, the same applies for private investors as well. And why would they invest in mega projects? Is really understanding the benefits. What is the value? What comes out the other the side of that? And I think that's been something we've done some work on in the last 12, 18 months in HS2, where we've created effectively a benefits baseline. We're very clear about what we're delivering today, and we can start evidencing, and again, quite important in the current economic climate, the jobs we're creating, the opportunities for young people, the social value. There's a number of funds that we've made available at HS2 for investment in community projects and environmental projects, local business projects, because it's all well and good us talking about 44 billion and this number of people and this how fast the trains are going to go in the future. But here and now, that doesn't seem very relevant for a lot of people. And people inevitably are going to personalize that to, so what's in it for me? So you've got to strike this balance about how do you take people with you through the life of the construction? Because again, I think a factor of mega projects is they take a long time. So people can't really get a sense of what that legacy and sort of end product looks like, because in many respects, it's just too far into the future. So how do you make things sort of relevant and relatable for folks today as you're building the asset, whatever it might be, assuming it's in the built environment, so that people can sort of get on board. And that's been, why we talk about the 3 C's, the sort of the strategic case, because I think people are increasingly becoming aware of, our personal and collective carbon footprints. Saw on the news only last night about how, the west coast of the US and Canada are literally sort of overheating. And we're seeing this increasingly in terms of climate change and the impact of the carbon we generate. And I think the built environment has got a lot of work to do to sort of drive carbon out. So when you start to talk about projects in impacting the carbon footprint of a country, how we get to net zero, how we sort of create connectivity, which in turn creates economic growth and prosperity, these start to become currencies that people can buy into, because I think the sort of currency of the project community around cost and time and safety and earned value, frankly, that's something for us as practitioners we need to hold true to help us deliver these things, but they don't really mean a lot to the people who are paying for it, which in our case in the UK here are our taxpayers. So, I think that's been a real education for me as the leader of the organization to find a way of creating a narrative and a language that not just to maybe an audience like this, but to a much more diverse, more public audience, you're able to articulate what the project's doing and the value of the project in a way that is more meaningful.
Fantastic. Well, the carbon perspective is so important these days, and to the next generation as well. The other point you mentioned is the capability program that you implemented, and perhaps reflecting when you joined the organization and thinking about this concept of an integrated enterprise. How did you perhaps turn around or develop the organization in a multifaceted perspective with development, delivery, entities and phases all together? So that concept of homeostasis, it brings to the organizational stability, perhaps, of the integrated enterprise of the supply chain. I wonder if you could share a bit more about the capability program in place from the CEO perspective.
Yeah, so a couple of things. In the early days, we realized we needed to sort of meet, first we needed to set a sort of capability threshold, and then we need to work out how we were going to meet it. And although the contract at HS2 Limited that I run with government talked about meeting a sort of a level of acceptable capability, sort of what was acceptable wasn't determined. So we did quite a lot of work looking at various sort of maturity models, that are in the sort of both the project and the corporate world, and what would be the most appropriate one. We landed on this CMMI model, which I'm sure some of the audience where we sort of somewhat bespoke it to suit our needs. We identified 27 capability areas, and then we drove a program for each of those. Each capability area had a nominated sort of functional lead. We agreed, for the model, where we need to get to. We broke the model down into 6 operating layers, and we said by the beginning of by the end of 2019, we need to get to level 3 on a 5-point scale. So again, we took a very programmatic approach, because that's sort of how we think here. And we brought an independent panel in to advise the board on our approach and our methodology. And I think the other important point is I was the executive sponsor. So this wasn't something I could delegate to one of my exec team, like my HR director or the delivery director. When we talked about what we needed to do to get to the capability level, it struck me that the chief executive needs to be the personal executive sponsor of this. And in dealing with the team and the consultants that helped us do it, one of their observations, having done similar exercises in other organizations, was, we've never had a project like this with so much access to the chief exec, but we've also never seen a program like this drive so much change into organization, because people know the chief exec is sort of sponsoring it, even if they don't necessarily feel sort of the impact of my input up close. So I was very aware of my responsibility to set the tone of why this was important, explain it to the employees in the organization as something that's really critical, that everyone needs to be sort of participate in. And because we broke it down into functional areas, it transcends the phases. So whether you're in phase 1, 2A or 2B, it didn't matter. If you were in the land and property team, and whether you were serving one of those phases, you needed to be part of a team that got to a certain level, or you're in project controls, or in risk management, or in finance, or in stakeholder management. So as we sort of decomposed the major functions of the company, it became relevant for everybody, and everyone understood that getting to level 3 and having that being evidenced and sort of assured with 3 lines of defense was a crucial prerequisite of us getting the green light to move to the next phase. So it was a massive undertaking, and again, as you and I have discussed, something that probably is almost a sort of talk all in its own right for those who would be interested.
Brilliant, absolutely brilliant. Building on that, if I could combine 3 questions here from the audience. There is a lot coming through from different participants in different continents on collaboration and integration, and systems integration in particular. So there is a lot about systems integration these days in previous projects, etc. And one of the considerations is how you're thinking about HS2 as this multifaceted organization and the end state in mind. So how are you perhaps working backwards from that integration point of view in a systems-wide perspective?
Yeah, and in some respects, you've answered the question for me, Julian, so thanks for that. But we're doing exactly that. So there's quite a lot of what I call systems thinking going at the front end. So even now, all our contracts, we're very clear around what the interface is between the contracts, where obviously some contracts are further advanced than others. We are the ultimate system authority as HS2, so where we're having to do reference design to make sure the reference design for all of the various assets hangs together to give you an integrated system. The other thing we've got in the organization is a sort of an operations and maintenance and asset management function. So they're really thinking about what it looks like at the right-hand side of the schedule and are working back. And we've done a lot of work thinking about how do we open this railway in an incremental way through various configuration states, and what needs to be true at each configuration state to be able to incrementally open up more and more sort of capability for the railway. And of course, the intent is that these 2 things we manage left to right in a more conventional programmatic way, but we sort of also work right to left to understand what needs to be true to make sure the railway literally is physically integrated as a system is very much what we've set up. It's, frankly, as a sort of methodology, it's been in existence for 18, 24 months. It's really going to be put to the test in the next few years, because it will be easy, of course, to all get consumed with all the challenges of the civils program and the stations programs, and sort of take one eye off of the systems challenges. So again, the sort of point around homeostasis and balance is we as an executive team need to make sure we give an appropriate amount of time to have conversations around and ask the questions of the team on all these facets of the project, and we don't unduly sort of skew ourselves into one or other of these areas. And that's a question you should ask me again in 4 or 5 years, because that's when we know whether the work the foundations we put in place today are bearing the fruit. What I will say is we've been sort of quite blessed. I mean, Crossrail's had a difficult time, as some folks will know, over the last couple of years, and there's a lot of work now going on to integrate the Crossrail systems and get it open next year. But of course, there's a huge amount of learning coming out of Crossrail, which we're getting the benefit of, and the team there have been very open with us about what they have learned from trying to almost integrate the system at the back end of the project, rather than almost integrating it where we're trying to get to, is right at the front end.
Excellent. And that leads very nicely to the next question coming up on leadership, and perhaps the micro practices of leadership in today operations that really bring people together and create teams, multiple teams across the organization, not only HS2, but several partners, as you outlined. Perhaps from a leadership perspective, how do you foster the environment of collaboration through hard and sort of more informal metrics and structures with the supply chain?
Yeah, it's a good question. Again, there's sort of multiple interventions have helped us, move that forward. Some of it's around sort of personal perspective. So I'm very aware as the CEO, I sort of set the tone for how I would expect the organization to operate and sort of behave. And again, that's why I think the values have been very useful, because they're sort of relevant, and any individual can interpret their own view of it, respect or integrity or health, safety and well-being or leadership. But actually, it creates a sort of language for us all that we can all relate to. And then when we've sort of, I won't say we've imposed it, but where we've brought those to life in engaging with our supply chain, they've embraced that. So we've pushed a little bit and they've pulled, and all of a sudden you're starting to see those values come to life in the supply chain. So again, you create a sort of framework for people to start to work together with some implicit rules of engagement that start to mean that collaboration and working together and respect and integrity. And when I talk about the HS2 family, and people say, what do you mean by family? I said, think about family in a very personal case. It's about care, it's about compromise, it's about unconditional commitment to the same end. It's about working together to sort of look after each other. And it's sort of, people can relate to that in their personal lives. If you can get people finding a way of bringing that to life in their professional lives, with the sort of mission of HS2 being really clear, because that's one of the things that becomes obvious to me. I talk to a lot of new starters. They say, the mission is very clear. The enthusiasm and the energy to build this new railway is sort of very sort of worn on the sort of hearts and the sleeves of all the employees. So I've done a lot of work with the CEOs. I've made it very clear to the CEOs that actually this is a huge undertaking for the UK sector, infrastructure sector, that the opportunity to sort of reset the way we do big mega projects like this in the UK is an opportunity we must not let pass us. So I've said to the CEOs, as much as I might be the chief executive of HS2, as a collective, we all have responsibility to deliver this project successfully for the government. Whether it's through their shareholders and their supply chains, they've all got not just a financial, but a sort of an emotional vested interest in the thing making it a success. So effectively, it's about having all those conversations at multiple levels right across the enterprise, so people understand what you're trying to achieve. And my sort of simple view, and I have to try and keep things simple in my job, is if I can create an environment where people can do their best work and they can have fun doing it and they can work with colleagues, and the sort of sense of teamwork, which we all know is a lot of fun. It's why a lot of people work in projects, because they enjoy the sort of fun that comes with teamwork. If we can create an environment where people can experience it every day, I think you're onto something, because then, whatever formality and structures and organizational procedures you put in place, they have a place. But actually, smart, curious, ingenious people, they will find a way of getting things done well. And that's sort of been at the heart of what we've tried to do. And, it's early days. We've still got a lot to do on this project, but it's so far bearing good fruit, and long may that continue.
Fantastic. One of the points you mentioned, and there is a lot of research, of course, in this area, is the political interference or the disturbance of what you labeled the outside environment or the outside world. So you just touched upon the technical complexity, and architects, professionals, engineers, problem solvers really cracking the problem and moving industry forward in different ways. And sometimes in mega projects, it's not often discussed, these interferences from the outside that really create a barrier or constraint to people in terms of developing and advancing their own jobs. So in that regard, how are you managing that interface with the sponsor and wider political domain?
Yeah, and it's a great question, because I think we all know that where sort of politics and projects sort of bleed into each other too much, that can easily be a sort of recipe for disaster. Just the rules of engagement are different. But clearly, mega projects by their nature are always going to be political, in my personal view, whether they're publicly or private sector, regardless of the sector they're in. So I think the reality is it's one of the dimensions of the world in which we exist. We have to respect that it's there. We have to respect that the politicians are going to have strong opinions and views about what we do. They're ultimately accountable to Parliament, in my case, for the success of the project. So naturally, where I have got a dedicated minister, he rightly is going to hold me to account and expect to make sure that I'm doing my job properly and all the rest of it. So I think it's about making sure that you're set up to deal with it. That if, again, come back to the point around sort of balance, the homeostasis point, the politics doesn't unduly skew management effort in one direction, because if you're not careful, that could become quite destructive, and of course, and certainly a distraction when, in my case, with HS2, we're about 1,800 people, which says we've got about 14,000 people in the supply chain. So that's where our focus needs to be. But equally, we've got this sort of political issue along the line of route, being a long, a linear project. It touches, as I've already said, the lives of lots of people. It goes through lots of parliamentary constituencies, through local authorities, through sort of county or London boroughs. So again, we've got this sort of central political dimension that we need to be very sensitive to and respectful of, but also we've got this line of route sort of political dimension as well. And so we've set ourselves up. We've got a 24/7 help desk. We've got probably 90 community engagement people on the front line. All of our contractors have got obligations under their contract to use the help desk and put their own community engagement people on the ground, so they can consult with local people, so they know where, for example, we're closing roads, or we're going to sort of do utility diversions, or we're going to sort of have an impact on people's lives. Making sure that we're considerate, that we're respectful. It's all part of managing that dimension to the project, and that's why for me it's of equal measure with those other three quadrants in that sort of homeostasis model. Because I think if you ignore that, you ignore it at your peril. And if you sort of take the view that, well, the politics is for the politicians and I'm just a project delivery practitioner, so leave me alone to get on with delivering, frankly, I think it's a recipe for disaster. So it has its place. You've got to keep it in balance with all those other demands on not just your time as the leader of the organization, but the organization as a whole.
Excellent, thanks for that, Mark. And we have a lot coming as well about risk and uncertainty. And obviously the pandemic has a big uncertainty there as well. So the structures that you have in place, perhaps to deal with known risks and increasingly circumstances and events that you cannot really foresee in advance. So how do you manage that through the organization and your capability program?
Yeah, well, if you can imagine on an enterprise that's got the sort of layers of HS2, we're managing a risk at multiple levels. So at the board, we have a conversation around strategic risk. So these would be sort of extraneous events, many of which we can't control, but they are genuine threats to the program. And as a board, at least, as of every quarter, there's a board owner and an exec management team owner of each of those strategic risks, and we make sure we understand that risk and the sort of likely impacts it could have if it was to manifest itself on HS2. And of course, then by each of the phases, we broke that down into sort of program and project and contract risk. So again, it's a fairly sophisticated system. So this for me would sit in the sort of governance and controls quadrant. The line of sight and the transparency of that risk management is important right from the contract level right up to the top of the business as we aggregate risks and we quantify them. We use the trend system. So we encourage project and contract managers to sort of put trends in the system early. It's almost like an early warning system, so we can see risks coming towards us in time, because they sort of, so we don't get any surprises. So again, it's a pretty sophisticated system, as you can imagine. It's using fundamentally well-established risk management techniques. We've just had to scale it up to deal with the size of this project. And that, I think, is one of the observations I often make about HS2 as a mega project. There's nothing we're actually doing that's fundamentally revolutionary. If you break it down into its component parts, if you look at all the sort of, all the cogs in the wheel, they're things that you'd recognize across any mega project, or in fact a major project, not just in this country, but globally. But the reality is we're doing it on a scale that's unprecedented. And that's the challenge, is how do you scale up all of the project and risk management, contract management techniques so that it all becomes part of one sort of integrated homogeneous system. And that's been really where the capability program has been instrumental, because it's forced us to, again, sort of systematically go through each layer in the operating model and really understand, are we fit for purpose for that particular area of capability, of which risk management actually was one of them. So, these things, again, are all connected.
Perfect. And that brings us to perhaps the last question and the final considerations. And one of the points that you mentioned, it was quite clear in your model as well, is that as a system, as a mega project, so we have different components, and in each one of those, obviously there will be an overall systems performance of the whole mega project, but there are excellent examples that you outline in terms of cases of successful practices being implemented in each one of those components within the mega project. And that's perhaps my challenge to the industry to start to highlight those practices in mega projects, in major mega projects, instead of talking about one single project and the cost narrative only. So there is so much more on that. So I wonder if you could reflect on that and share your final considerations, just mindful of the time as well.
Yeah, yeah. Well, I think 2 points to make there. I think there's an opportunity in something just within the confines of HS2 to sort of drive learning and best practice across different facets of the program. I mean, the beauty of HS2 with 3 phases is, as you can imagine, as I said on one of the earlier slides, we're now really standing up an organization that's transitioning from sort of pre-Royal Ascent and development into delivery. But as we make that transition, there's a lot of learning going on. A lot of the people are moving, frankly, with, who've come out of phase 1, and they're going to do a similar role on phase 2A with all the learning of having done it once before. So there's a sort of embedded learning and transfer of practice within the project. And I could cite many examples, but we haven't got time. And I think the other thing, to your point, is what it's important for us to do, and today's a bit of a platform for me to talk to this audience, but we're using our learning legacy work, and we're starting to capture now, sort of 9-10 years before the railway opens, we're starting to capture on our learning legacy portal some of the experience of what we've had, because HS2 has been around now for 10 years or more, and making sure that that is captured for, the wider academic and practitioner arena to use in the future. Because again, the investment in HS2 is great to build a railway, but there are so many other sort of secondary and tertiary benefits that we need to make sure we don't lose, because frankly, that would be, inexcusable for us all. And I think there's something for the academic community, I think, there to help us as practitioners work together to make sure we capture the learning and the experience in a way that's transferable and reusable in other contexts.
Wonderful. Mark, thanks very much for joining us today. And it was a brilliant keynote in many perspectives to inaugurate our CEO series. So on behalf of UCL and IPMA, very much appreciate your time and the great enhancements that you're doing to the UK economy in different perspectives of a very complex project, and that you outlined very well. So thanks again for joining us today. Thanks everybody for attending the session.